Welcome to NovelsAudio.com. We hope you have a relaxing and enjoyable time.
The winter light fell like shards of ice through the floor-to-ceiling windows of AethelCorp's 42nd floor boardroom, fracturing into geometric patterns on the obsidian table. Julian Ashford stood at the head of that table, a figure carved from the same cold materials as the city outside, steel, glass, and the particular shade of gray that money wears when it has forgotten its own warmth. He did not watch the door. He did not need to. The woman would arrive precisely at 9:47 a.m., as instructed by his assistant, because the world he had built operated on the premise that his instructions were the only architecture that mattered. The contract lay before him, 73 pages bound in charcoal linen, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. He knew every clause by heart, had dictated them himself in the small hours of the morning when the penthouse felt too large and the city's lights too distant. Clause 4.2, medical compliance. Clause 8.7, termination of parental rights. Clause 12.1, non-disclosure in perpetuity. A paper fortress built to withstand the siege of human emotion. His thumb traced the edge of the document, feeling the weight of the future it contained. An heir, a legacy. Proof that the Ashford name would outlast the man who carried it. The elevator chimed. Julian did not look up. He had learned long ago that anticipation was a weakness, a crack in the armor through which disappointment could seep. Instead, he listened to the whisper of the hydraulic doors, to the soft tread of footsteps on marble, to the rustle of fabric that was not silk or wool but something rougher, more organic. Her coat smelled of rain and turpentine. He caught it before he saw her, that scent of wet wool and chemical solvent, and something in his chest tightened, an unfamiliar sensation, quickly suppressed. He raised his eyes. Eliza Vance stood in the doorway of his boardroom, and the winter light caught her like a stage spotlight, illuminating the smudge of charcoal on her cheekbone, the frayed cuff of her sweater, the way her fingers curled around the strap of a canvas bag that had clearly seen better decades. She was not beautiful in the way the women of his world were beautiful, polished, curated, safe. She was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, wild, unpredictable, carrying the promise of disruption. Mr. Ashford, her voice was lower than he had expected, with a roughness that suggested she had spent the morning in conversation with no one but herself. Ms. Vance. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Please. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, her boots leaving faint impressions on the marble floor, not heels, but flat-soled shoes, the kind worn by people who spent their days on their feet, creating things with their hands. She pressed her palm against the glass, and he watched her breath fog the surface, obscuring the city he owned. You can see everything from here, she said, but nothing can see in. It was not a question. He did not offer an answer. She turned, finally, and took the seat he had indicated. Her eyes scanned the contract, not with the hunger of a lawyer seeking loopholes, but with the wariness of an animal assessing a trap. She read the first page, then the second, her lips moving slightly as if she were memorizing the words that would bind her. The timelines are aggressive, Julian said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being the only speaker in the room. Insemination in 2 weeks, medical screenings 3 times weekly. You will move into the penthouse immediately. Transportation has been arranged for your belongings this afternoon. She did not look up. My belongings fit in 2 bags. Then the transition will be efficient. Her finger traced a line of text. Clause 3.4. The surrogate agrees to abstain from all artistic activities involving chemical solvents during the term of this agreement. She raised her eyes, and he saw something flicker there, not anger, but something older, more stubborn. My work requires turpentine. Your work requires a healthy gestation. The solvents pose a risk to fetal development. My work, she said, each word measured, is the only thing that makes me feel like I exist outside of other people's definitions of me. Julian felt the first crack in his patience, a hairline fracture, barely perceptible. He had anticipated compliance, not philosophy. The contract is non-negotiable, Ms. Vance. The terms have been reviewed by counsel on both sides. Your signature indicates acceptance. She closed the document. The sound was soft, but it echoed in the cathedral silence of the room. I'd like to see the penthouse. It was not a request. It was a demand, wrapped in the polite language of a woman who had learned to make demands sound like favors. Julian considered refusing. The tour was scheduled for after the signing, a formality, not a precondition, but something in her posture, the way her shoulders squared against the weight of his authority, made him pause. Very well. The elevator ride was silent. He stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, watching the numbers climb. She stood in the corner, her canvas bag clutched to her chest, and he could feel her presence like a scent he could not identify, something floral, something chemical, something alive. The penthouse occupied the entire 45th floor, a glass-walled cage suspended above the city. Julian had designed it himself, working with architects who understood that luxury was not about comfort but about control. Every surface was polished, every angle precise, every color chosen from a palette that excluded warmth, white marble, chrome fixtures, furniture that looked as if it had been arranged by a curator rather than lived in. Eliza stepped inside and stopped. He watched her take it in, the vast living room, the kitchen that had never seen a meal cooked, the hallway that led to bedrooms. She would occupy but never own. She walked to the center of the room, turned slowly, her eyes tracing the walls. "It's a mausoleum," she said. The word landed like a stone in still water. Julian felt the ripples spread through his chest, unsettling something he had carefully buried. "It's minimalist," he corrected. "It's empty." She walked to the wall that faced the city, the one that would catch the sunrise if the building were not positioned to face west. "There's nothing here that breathes, no plants, no photographs, no evidence that a human being has ever existed in this space. That's the point." She turned to face him, and for the first time he saw something like pity in her eyes. "No, Mr. Ashford, that's the problem." She walked through the penthouse then, her bare feet leaving faint prints on the marble. She had kicked off her boots at the door, a gesture of such casual defiance that he had not known how to respond. She moved through the rooms like a curator assessing a museum, touching surfaces, opening cabinets, peering into corners. He followed at a distance, a ghost in his own kingdom, watching her disrupt the order. He had spent years constructing. When she returned to the living room, she stopped in front of the wall where he had planned to hang a Rothko, a painting he had purchased but never installed because the color felt too close to something he did not want to name. "I want one painting," she said. "Mine, on this wall." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge dressed as a request. Julian's jaw tightened. The contract forbade personal effects that altered the aesthetic of the residence. He had written that clause himself, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion, the slow creep of personality into a space designed to reflect nothing but power. "The contract? I know what the contract says." She crossed her arms, and he noticed the calluses on her fingers, the way she held herself like someone who had learned to fight for every inch of ground. "But you want me to live here for 9 months. You want me to carry your child. You want me to submit to medical screenings and dietary restrictions and a schedule that leaves no room for my own life." She took a step toward him, and he did. "Not retreat. Give me one wall, Mr. Ashford, one painting. Let me feel like I exist in this place, and I will give you everything else." The calculation happened automatically, faster than thought. A single painting. A concession that could be framed as a gesture of goodwill, not a breach of protocol. The board would not see it as weakness, they would see it as strategy, a way to ensure compliance through the illusion of autonomy. He nodded. The word felt like a wound. Eliza smiled, a small, quiet thing, not triumphant but relieved. "Thank you." She moved to the window, and he watched her silhouette against the city lights, the curve of her shoulder, the fall of her hair, the way her hand rested on her stomach as if she were already protecting something he had paid for. The gesture was unconscious, he knew, but it unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. "I'll have my things sent up tonight," she said, her voice softer now. "The painting and a few other things, nothing that will disturb your aesthetic. The movers will be here at 6. She nodded, and he turned to leave, his heels clicking on the marble floor. At the door he paused, his hand on the frame. "Ms. Vance." She looked up. "The medical screening is tomorrow at 8. A car will collect you." "I'll be ready." He left without another word, but as the elevator descended, he realized he could still smell her, the rain, the turpentine, the faint sweetness of a woman who had not yet learned to fear him. The scent clung to his suit, to his skin, to the air he breathed. That night, Julian Ashford dreamed of his mother. She was standing in a kitchen he had not seen in 30 years, her back to him, her hands moving over a stove that had never produced a meal he remembered. The air was thick with perfume, jasmine, roses, something floral that had always made his eyes water. She was humming, a fragment of a lullaby, and he was standing in the doorway, small and silent, waiting for her to turn around. She never did. He woke in the dark, the penthouse silent around him, the city lights casting long shadows across the ceiling. His chest was tight, his breath shallow, and he did not know why. He rose. His feet carried him down. The hallway, past the kitchen, past the living room, to the door of the room where Eliza Vance was sleeping. The door was slightly ajar. He stood in the darkness, a ghost in his own kingdom, and through the crack he saw her, curled on her side, her hand resting on her stomach, her lips parted in sleep. The moonlight fell across her face, softening the lines of defiance he had seen in the boardroom, revealing something younger, more fragile. She was protecting something, already. A life he had paid for, a future he had contracted, a legacy he had designed. But as he watched her breathe, he felt something shift, a tremor in the armor he had worn for so long that he had forgotten it was not his skin. He did not enter. He stood there in the darkness until the first light of dawn began to silver the edges of the city. And when he finally turned away, he carried with him the echo of a lullaby he had not heard in 30 years, and the scent of a woman who was not his mother, but who had already begun to haunt him in the same way. Chapter 2. The scent of turpentine. The city was still a black mirror at 4:27 a.m., its lights bleeding into the sky like a wound that refused to close. Julian Ashford's eyes opened before the alarm, they always did, and he lay motionless for exactly 7 seconds, cataloging the silence. The penthouse breathed around him, the hum of climate control, the distant sigh of an elevator shaft, the absence of anything human. He rose. Cold shower. Black coffee. The precise temperature of the water measured by muscle memory, the coffee ground to a specification he had long ago committed to neural pathways rather than paper. At 4:34, he stood before the treadmill, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering him the city he owned, a kingdom of glass and steel that answered to no one but him. The run was ritual. 10 kilometers in exactly 42 minutes, his heartbeat a metronome, his reflection a ghost superimposed over the waking skyline. He did not think during these runs. Thinking was for the boardroom, for the quarterly reports, for the calculations that kept AethelCorp's blood flowing. Here, there was only the rhythm of feet on rubber, the burn of lungs, the clean emptiness of a mind that had learned, long ago, to feel nothing. At 5:16 he stepped off the treadmill. His body was slick with sweat, his muscles humming with the familiar ache of discipline. He toweled off, drank water, exactly 350 milliliters, and walked through the penthouse toward his study. The lights were dim. The spaces pristine. Every surface reflected nothing. Every corner held no memory. He stopped. The door to the guest suite, her door, was open. Julian's jaw tightened. The contract had specified, the surrogate shall maintain private quarters and refrain from occupying shared spaces between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. unless expressly authorized. He had written that clause himself, had considered it reasonable, necessary, a boundary drawn in ink and legal weight, and yet, he stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the marble. The hallway opened into the living room, and there, in the gray pre-dawn light, stood an easel. A canvas. A woman. Eliza Vance was painting. She had not heard him. Her back was to him, her body swaying slightly as her arm moved in long, violent arcs across the surface. She wore an oversized t-shirt, something faded, soft, utterly wrong for this place, and her hair was a tangle of dark waves that caught the first suggestion of sunrise through the glass. She was barefoot. Of course she was barefoot. And then the smell hit him. Turpentine. It invaded his nostrils with the force of a physical blow, sharp, chemical, alive. It was the smell of creation, of chaos, of something that could not be controlled or contained. It clung to the air, to the furniture, to the inside of his lungs. He wanted to open a window. He wanted to call for ventilation. He wanted to erase it, but he did not move. He watched. Her mixed colors on a palette, burnt sienna, ultramarine, a green so deep and strange it reminded him of a forest he had once seen in a photograph, a place he had never visited, a world he had never allowed himself to want. Her brush strokes were not careful. They were not precise. They were furious asterisk, as if the storm on the canvas was a storm inside her, and she was trying to paint her way out of it. The painting was a storm. Dark clouds, a churning sea, a single streak of white that might have been lightning or might have been a bird or might have been something breaking. He watched for 3 minutes, maybe 4, he lost count. Then she paused, her hand dropping to her side, and she tilted her head as if listening for something. He held his breath. She did not turn, but she said softly without looking, "You can come in, I don't bite." Julian's face went cold. He had not made a sound, he was certain of it. "I'm not," he began. "You're breathing," she said. "You breathe differently than the building." He said nothing. He did not step forward. Eliza turned, finally, and looked at him. Her eyes were the color of the green on her palette, that strange, deep forest green. She was not surprised to see him. She was not intimidated. She was simply there asterisk, a fact he could not argue with. "It's early," he said. "It's always." "Early for you," she replied. "I heard you running. The treadmill vibrates through the floor." He filed that information away. The surrogate is a light sleeper. The surrogate is observant. The surrogate is a problem. "The designated studio is on the lower level," he said. "It has proper ventilation, north-facing windows, a sink." "I know," she said. "Then why are you here?" She looked at the painting, then back at him. "Because the light is better at this hour, and because you told me not to." The words hung between them, simple and sharp as glass. Julian felt something stir in his chest, irritation, yes, but also something else. Something he refused to name. He turned and walked to the kitchen. The kitchen was his sanctuary. It was not because he cooked. He did not cook, had never cooked, employed a private chef who prepared meals according to a rotating nutritional schedule, but because the kitchen was the most ordered room in the penthouse. Every appliance was flush with the cabinetry. Every surface was a seamless expanse of white marble. The spices were arranged alphabetically in a drawer. The refrigerator contained precisely labeled containers of prepared food, each with a date and a calorie count. He opened the refrigerator, stared at the containers, closed it. He opened a cabinet, took out a glass, filled it with water, drank it, washed the glass, dried it, put it back. He did this because it was routine. He did this because routine was control. He did this because if he stopped, he would have to think about the smell of turpentine and the way she had said you breathed differently and the fact that he had watched her paint for 4 minutes without moving. He turned. There was a coffee cup on the marble island. It was white. It was ceramic. It was empty. And around its base, a ring of brown stained the surface, a perfect circle of negligence, of carelessness, of asterisk mess asterisk. Julian stared at it. The contract had a clause for this. The surrogate shall maintain cleanliness of shared spaces. He had written it himself. He could enforce it. He could deduct from her stipend. He picked up the cup. He carried it to the sink. He washed it. He dried it. He put it away. The ring remained. He took a sponge. He scrubbed. The ring faded, then disappeared. The marble was pristine again. He stood there, sponge in hand, and felt nothing. Or rather, he felt the absence of something, a hollow where satisfaction should have been. At 7:23 a.m., he was in his study, reviewing the quarterly projections for the Southeast Asian expansion, when the smell changed. It was no longer just turpentine. It was garlic, onions, something that sizzled and popped and filled the air with a warmth that did not belong in this building of glass and steel. He set down his tablet. He walked to the kitchen. Eliza was there. She stood at the stove, his asterisk stove, the one that had never been used, the one that gleamed like a black mirror, and she was cooking. A pan of oil shimmered. Chopped garlic hissed. She had a knife in her hand, and she was dicing an onion with the kind of reckless speed that suggested she had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 kitchens that were nothing like this one. She was still barefoot. Her hair was still loose. She wore the same t-shirt, and there was a smear of blue paint on her forearm. "Sit," she said without turning. He did not sit. She turned, the knife still in her hand, and looked at him. "I'm making breakfast. You have a kitchen full of ingredients that have never been touched. It's a crime. I have a chef. Your chef is scheduled for dinner. It's breakfast. Sit." He did not sit, but he did not leave. She shrugged and turned back to the stove. She added the onions, and they sizzled, and the smell grew stronger, richer, more invasive. She hummed while she worked, a melody he did not recognize, something minor and melancholy and strangely beautiful. Julian stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and watched a woman he had contracted to carry his child cook a meal he had not ordered, and he did not know what to do with his hands. She finished. She plated 2 portions, eggs, vegetables, something that smelled of herbs, and heat, and set one on the island. The other she carried to the small breakfast nook by the window, where she sat and began to eat. "I'm not hungry," he said. "That's fine," she said. "But it's good, you should try it." He did not try it. He watched her eat. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every bite. She closed her eyes once, and he saw her shoulders drop, saw the tension leave her for just a moment. She looked in that moment like someone who had forgotten where she was. When she finished, she carried her plate to the sink, rinsed it, and left it there. Not in the dishwasher. Not washed. Rinsed. Julian's eye twitched. She walked past him, close enough that he could smell her, turpentine and garlic and something floral, something soft. She paused. "The eggs are getting cold," she said. And then she was gone, back to her painting, back to her storm. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. The eggs cooled. The smell of garlic began to fade. He did not eat them, but he did not throw them away either. At 6:47 p.m., the sun was setting, and Julian was in his study reviewing the medical schedule for the coming week. The surrogate's first official appointment was in 3 days: blood work, psychological evaluation, a full physical. He had already reviewed the clinic's protocols, had vetted the staff, had ensured that every procedure would be documented and verified. The child his child would be conceived in a sterile environment under controlled conditions with no variables left to chance. He looked up. Eliza was in the living room. She had moved the easel closer to the window, and she was painting in the golden light of dusk. The storm on the canvas had changed, the clouds were breaking, the sea was calmer, and the streak of white had become something else. A figure, maybe. A shape emerging from the chaos. He watched her for a moment, then he looked down at the sofa. There was a smear of blue paint on the white fabric. It was small, no larger than his thumb, but it was unmistakable. A wound in the pristine, a scar on the perfection. Julian's hands began to tremble. He stood. He walked to the sofa. He stood over the stain, and he felt something rising in him, a rage that had nothing to do with the fabric, a fury that was not about paint or furniture or the cost of rooflstring. It was about her asterisk. It was about the way she had invaded his space, his schedule, his lungs. It was about the coffee cup and the eggs and the humming and the fact that he had watched her paint at dawn and had not said a word. He pressed the intercom. "Cleaning. Now." The door to the guest suite opened. Eliza appeared, a rag in her hand. She walked past him without looking, knelt before the sofa, and began to rub the stain. "It's just paint," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "It washes off." He watched her fingers move, the same fingers that had signed the contract, the same fingers that would one day hold his child. She pressed the rag into the fabric, working the stain with a patience that seemed infinite. The blue began to lift, to transfer to the cloth, to disappear. "There," she said, "good as new." She stood, the stained rag in her hand, and looked at him. Her eyes were not defiant. They were not apologetic. They were simply their asterisk, green and deep and full of something he could not read. "You don't have to be afraid of mess, Julian," she said. "It's just life." She walked away. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, the lights off, the city glittering beyond the glass. The sofa was visible through the open door, the spot where the stain had been now indistinguishable from the rest of the fabric. But he knew it was there. He could see it in his mind, a ghost of blue, a mark that had been erased but not forgotten. He pulled out the contract. He read the clause on asterisk damage to property. He read the clause on asterisk cleanliness of shared spaces. He read the clause on surrogate conduct during tenancy. And then he tore the page in half. He took out a fresh sheet of paper. He uncapped. His pen, a Mont Blanc black ink, the same pen he used to sign billion-dollar acquisitions, and he wrote, "The surrogate may inhabit the space as her own." He did not know why he wrote it. He did not know what it meant. He only knew that the smell of turpentine was still in his nose, and that for the first time in years, he felt like he was breathing. The next morning, he slipped the rewritten clause under her door. He waited. 20 minutes passed. 30. He was in his study pretending to work when he heard her footsteps. She appeared in the doorway, the paper in her hand, her hair still wet from a shower. She read it again. Her eyes softened, just a fraction, just enough for him to see. Then they hardened. "You think this changes anything?" she asked, her voice quiet, steady. "You think a line on a page makes this a home?" She set the paper on his desk. She turned, she walked away. But at the door she paused, and he saw it. A smile, small, brief, a crack in her armor, barely visible, quickly hidden. She left. Julian sat alone in his study, the rewritten clause before him. He picked it up. He read it again. The surrogate may inhabit the space as her own. He folded the paper. He put it in his pocket. And for the first time in his life, Julian Ashford did not know what to do next. Asterisk Chapter 3. The humming of wires asterisk, the morning arrived like a summons. Vera stood at the threshold of the penthouse at precisely 8:47 a.m. Julian had timed it, of course, her posture a monument to corporate efficiency, her clipboard a scepter of authority. She wore a charcoal suit that matched the sky beyond the glass walls, and her smile was the kind that had been practiced in mirrors until it became indistinguishable from genuine warmth. "Ms. Vance," she said, her voice calibrated to the exact decibel that would not disturb but could not be ignored. "Dr. Harrington is expecting us at 9:15. I've arranged for a car." Eliza did not turn from her canvas. She had been painting since 4 in the morning, when the city below was still a circuit board of scattered lights, and the penthouse felt less like a cage and more like a cathedral. The painting was wrong, all wrong, but she kept working anyway, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the contract, the clauses, the way Julian's pen had moved across the paper like a scalpel. "Ms. Vance, I heard you." Vera's smile tightened at the edges. "Then you understand we have a schedule to keep." Eliza dipped her brush into a pool of ultramarine. The pigment bled into the canvas like a bruise. "I'm not going." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a system encounters an error it was not programmed to process. Vera's clipboard lowered by half an inch. "I'm sorry, you heard me." Eliza turned, finally, and the morning light caught her face. The hollows beneath her cheekbones, the defiance in her jaw, the exhaustion she had been hiding since she moved into this glass mausoleum 7 days ago. "I'm not going to the appointment." Vera's thumb moved to her phone. A text was sent. A protocol was activated. Eliza watched her and felt nothing but a strange, cold clarity. She had memorized the contract in the sleepless hours of her first night here, when the city lights had bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she had lain in a bed that cost more than her mother's entire house. She had read every clause, every subclause, every footnote written in language designed to obscure rather than illuminate, and she had found her weapon. Section 14, subsection C. The surrogate retains the right to refuse any medical procedure that violates her bodily autonomy, provided such refusal is documented in writing 48 hours in advance. She had written the letter at dawn. It was folded in the pocket of her paint-stained jeans. Julian Ashford received the text during a conference call with his Tokyo office. He read it once. He read it twice. Then he excused himself with a brevity that left his senior vice president mid-sentence, staring at a dead screen. The elevator ride from the 47th floor to the penthouse took 17 seconds. He used every one of them to compose himself, to remember who he was, what this arrangement was, why he had built his life on the unassailable logic of contracts and consequences. By the time the doors opened, he was Julian Ashford again. The man who had turned a failing steel mill into a global conglomerate, the man who had never lost a negotiation. The man who had not cried since he was 8 years old. He found her in the studio. The room was a disaster. Paint tubes lay scattered like casualties. The easel stood at an angle that offended his sense of order. And she was barefoot, her hair a tangle of dark curls, her hands stained cobalt and crimson. She was painting as if the world outside did not exist. "Eliza!" She did not stop. The brush moved in slow, deliberate strokes, building something he could not yet see. "The appointment," he said, his voice flat, controlled. "It's mandatory." "It's not." She still did not turn. "Section 14, subsection C, I have a letter." He felt the words land like a punch to the solar plexus. She had read the contract. She had memorized it. He had underestimated her. "This is about the child," he said, stepping closer. "It's about my body." She turned now, and the brush in her hand dripped blue onto the white marble floor. "You don't get to own it, Julian. You don't get to schedule it like a board meeting. You don't get to poke and prod and monitor because you're afraid of something you can't control." "I'm not afraid." She laughed. It was a sound like breaking glass, sharp, beautiful, dangerous. "You're terrified, that's why you built this." She gestured at the penthouse, the city, the empire. All of it, a fortress against the mess of being human. His jaw tightened. "You signed a contract. and I can break it. The termination clause carries a financial penalty of $1 million. I know, you don't have that kind of money. She set down the brush. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady. You think money is the only currency. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. My mother, she said, and the word caught in her throat, died of cancer when I was 19. She had insurance, but it wasn't enough. The treatments were experimental. The doctors said there was a chance, but the chance had a price tag. She took a step toward him. I watched her die in a hospital that smelled like bleach and despair, and I couldn't do anything because I didn't have the money to save her. Julian said nothing. He could feel the walls of his fortress cracking. You buy everything, Julian. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You bought me. You bought this child, but you can't buy my consent, you can't buy my trust, and you can't buy the right to treat me like a vessel for your legacy. He stood in the ruins of his certainty. The Tokyo call was still waiting. The board was watching. The entire machinery of AethelCorp was humming in the wires beneath his feet, waiting for his next command. He pulled out his phone. Vera, he said, his voice hoarse, take the rest of the day off. Cancel the appointment. He did not wait for her response. He hung up, pocketed the phone, and looked at Eliza with eyes that had forgotten how to see anything but spreadsheets and projections. Get your shoes, he said. We're going somewhere. The cafe was called the Yellow Door. It existed in a part of the city Julian had never visited, a neighborhood of narrow streets, mismatched awnings, and the kind of organic chaos that his security team would have flagged as a liability. The door was, in fact, yellow. The chairs did not match. The jukebox in the corner was playing something from the 1970s, a song about heartbreak and highways. Eliza ordered a croissant and a latte. Julian ordered nothing. He watched her eat. The croissant flaked apart in her hands, scattering crumbs across the scarred wooden table. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if she were savoring something she had been denied for a long time. A smear of butter caught the corner of her mouth, and she licked it off without thinking. Julian felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement, deep and irreversible. Why here? She asked. I don't know. You always know. He looked down at his hands. They were clean. They were always clean. He had spent his entire life avoiding messes, and now he was sitting in a cafe with mismatched chairs, watching a woman eat a croissant, and he had never felt more alive. You were right, he said. She stopped eating. About the fear. The words felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he had never learned. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be anything other than what I built. She reached across the table and touched his hand. Her fingers were stained with paint, ultramarine and crimson, and a hint of gold. Then learn, she said. That night, Eliza collapsed in the hallway. Julian heard the sound from his study, a soft thud followed by a breathless gasp. He was at her side in seconds, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands already reaching for her. She was pale, too pale. Her lips were tinged with blue. Eliza! She did not respond. He lifted her. She weighed nothing, nothing at all, and carried her to the elevator, his voice raw as he screamed at the driver to bring the car around. The city blurred past the windows, a smear of light and shadow. He held her against his chest, feeling the faint flutter of her pulse, and for the first time in his adult life, Julian Ashford prayed. Please, please, please. The emergency room was a nightmare of fluorescent light and antiseptic. Doctors moved around him, asking questions he could not answer, demanding information he did not have. He stood in the corner, his suit wrinkled, his hands stained with her paint, and watched them work. She's malnourished, a doctor said, finally, and severely stressed. The pregnancy is still viable, but if she doesn't gain weight and rest, she could lose the baby. Malnourished. The word hit him like a blade. He had prescribed the diet. He had enforced the schedule. He had treated her like a project, a portfolio, a line item in the grand ledger of his life, and he had nearly killed her. The doctor left. Julian sat in the chair beside her bed, the plastic cold against his back. He took her hand, her fingers were still stained with paint, and traced the veins in her wrist with his thumb. He did not think about the Tokyo merger. He did not think about the board, the shareholders, the legacy. He thought about the croissant, the crumbs, the way she had laughed in the studio, like breaking glass. When she opened her eyes, he was crying. He did not know how to stop. You're not a monster, she whispered. He shook his head, but she held his gaze, her eyes clear and steady despite the exhaustion. You're just a boy who doesn't know how to be loved. He left the room because he could not breathe. He stood in the hallway, his chest heaving, his hands shaking, and called his lawyer. "Rewrite the contract," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir?" "Everything, for her." He hung up and leaned against the wall, the fluorescent light buzzing above him like a trapped insect. Somewhere in the city, his empire was humming, waiting for him to return. Somewhere in the hospital room, Eliza was alive, her hand still warm from his touch. He did not know what came next. For the first time in his life, Julian Ashford had no plan, and it terrified him. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and false hope. Morning light, thin and pale as watered milk, filtered through the Venetian blinds, striping the walls in bars of gold and shadow. Julian Ashford sat in a chair that was not designed for sitting, rigid plastic, ergonomic in theory, cruel in practice, and watched Eliza Vance sleep. He had not slept. Not in 37 hours, not since he had received the call from the penthouse security system, a silent alarm triggered by a fall detected in the kitchen. He had been in a board meeting, mid-sentence, discussing the projected quarterly losses of the Southeast Asian division, when his phone vibrated with a notification he had programmed himself. The words had blurred, unauthorized movement detected. Subject unresponsive. He had left the room without explanation. Left 17 executives, 3 lawyers, and Marcus Thorne staring at an empty chair. Left a billion-dollar merger hanging in the balance like a guillotine blade. Now he sat in this chair, his suit jacket draped over the foot of Eliza's hospital bed, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, an act of undress he had not permitted himself in public in over a decade. His hands were clasped between his knees, knuckles white, the tendons in his forearms standing out like cables under tension. The head physician, a man named Dr. Hollings, had been fired at 2:47 a.m. Julian had made the call from the hallway, his voice flat, precise, each word a scalpel. "You will clear your desk by morning. Legal will contact you regarding the terms of your severance. If I find that your negligence contributed to her condition, I will sue you into bankruptcy, and I will ensure the medical board revokes your license." Hollings had sputtered something about standard protocols, about stress-induced syncope, about the patient's refusal to eat. Julian had hung up. He had not asked Eliza's permission. He had not needed to. The contract, the paper fortress, he had called it in his own mind, granted him medical decision-making authority for the duration of the pregnancy. It was Clause 14, subsection C, buried beneath the sterilization protocols and the genetic screening waivers. He had written it himself, years ago, when surrogacy was a clinical transaction, a line item on a quarterly balance sheet. He had never imagined he would use it to protect her from himself. Eliza stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy with sedation, and for a moment she seemed suspended between sleep and waking, a creature caught in amber. Then her eyes found him and she blinked. "You're still here," she said. Her voice was raw, scraped clean by the oxygen tube that had been removed an hour ago. "Yes, you didn't have to do that." She meant the doctor. She meant the vigil. She meant the way he had canceled his entire day, his entire week, his entire carefully calibrated existence to sit in a plastic chair and watch her breathe. Julian leaned forward. The chair creaked. "Yes, I did." The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been. He did not elaborate. He could not. To explain would be to admit that the contract had failed, that the paper fortress had developed a crack, that something had leaked through, something warm and irrational and dangerous. Eliza turned her head toward the window. The light caught the hollows under her cheekbones, the shadows beneath her eyes. She looked like a charcoal sketch, all line and absence. "You fired him," she said. It was not a question. He was negligent. "I fainted, Julian. People faint. It's not a crime. You fainted because you weren't eating." His voice was steel wrapped in silk. "You weren't eating because you were stressed. You were stressed because He stopped. The sentence collapsed under its own weight. "Because you what?" He did not answer. Instead, he reached into his briefcase, a slim black attaché, custom-made, the leather still stiff, and pulled out a sketchbook. Spiral-bound, heavy paper, the kind used by architects and artists who demanded precision. He placed it on the bedside table, alongside a small tin of charcoal pencils. Eliza stared at the offering, her lips parted, then closed. She did not thank him. She took the sketchbook. She opened it to a blank page, and she began to draw. The morning passed in a strange, suspended silence. Julian took calls in the hallway, his voice low and clipped. He arranged for a private chef, a French-trained nutritionist who specialized in prenatal care, to begin meal preparations immediately. He hired a therapist, a woman named Dr. Eris, who specialized in reproductive trauma and high-stress pregnancies. He ordered a blood analysis panel, a full metabolic workup, a cardiac ultrasound. He did not ask Eliza's permission for any of it. She did not protest. She drew. By noon, she had finished the portrait. She held it up, her fingers smudged with charcoal, and Julian saw himself rendered in grayscale, the hollow eyes, the clenched jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. It was not flattering. It was not meant to be. "This is you," she said, "before me." He took the sketchbook from her hands. He studied the image with the same clinical detachment he applied to quarterly reports and merger agreements. But something in his chest tightened, a muscle he had not used in years, a chamber of his heart that had been sealed off, condemned, declared structurally unsound. The boy in. The drawing was not a billionaire. He was not a CEO. He was not the architect of an empire that spanned 6 continents and employed 40,000 people. He was a child, standing in an empty room, waiting for a mother who would never come back. "It's accurate," he said, and handed the sketchbook back. Marcus Thorne arrived at 1:17 p.m. Julian heard him before he saw him, the sharp click of Italian leather on hospital linoleum, the low murmur of a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Marcus was a predator dressed in brioni, his silver hair swept back like a mane, his smile a surgical incision. He found Julian in the waiting room, standing by a window that overlooked the city. The skyline was a jagged crown of glass and steel, and Julian's reflection in the glass was a ghost superimposed over the empire he had built. "Julian." Marcus's voice was warm, almost paternal. It was the voice of a man who had perfected the art of the velvet knife. "I've been calling. I've been busy. So I see." Marcus gestured toward the closed door of Eliza's room. "The board is concerned. You missed the merger vote. You fired the head of obstetrics. You've been unreachable for 36 hours. I'm aware. The merger is worth $2.4 billion, Julian. The board wants to know if you've lost your mind or if this is a temporary lapse in judgment." Julian turned from the window. His face was a mask, cold and immaculate. "Tell the board that my personal affairs are none of their concern. They are when you sign over decision-making authority to a surrogate." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I've read the contract. I know the terms. She's a vessel, Julian, a means to an end. You're treating her like a wife." The word landed like a slap. Julian's jaw tightened. "She collapsed," he said. "She's carrying my child. I will not apologize for ensuring her safety." "No one is asking you to apologize. We're asking you to sign the merger documents." Marcus produced a leather folder from his briefcase, flipping it open to reveal a stack of papers. "The vote is in 3 days. If you don't sign, the board will be forced to consider a motion to remove you as CEO. You know what that means." Julian knew. It meant a hostile takeover. It meant his shares diluted, his vision dismantled, his legacy reduced to a footnote in a quarterly earnings report. It meant the empire he had built with blood and sleepless nights and the bones of his own childhood would be carved up and sold to the highest bidder. He looked at the documents. He looked at Marcus's polished smile. He looked at the closed door behind which Eliza lay, her charcoal-stained fingers, her hollow eyes, the child growing in her womb like a secret he had never meant to keep. "Then take it," Julian said. Marcus's smile flickered. "Excuse me? The empire, the merger, the CEO title." Julian stepped forward, and for a moment the mask cracked, something raw and desperate showing through. "Take it all. This empire is nothing if it's built on the bones of a woman." He stopped. The word hung in the air, unfinished, a half-formed creature that neither of them could name. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You what, Julian?" Julian did not answer. He turned and walked back into Eliza's room, closing the door behind him. She was awake. She had heard everything. The hospital walls were thin, and the waiting room was not far, and her ears had been straining for the sound of his voice ever since she had finished the portrait. She lay in the bed, her hands folded over her stomach, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "You didn't finish your sentence," she said. Julian stood at the foot of the bed. His hands were shaking. He did not know when that had started. "No," he said. "I didn't. Why not?" He looked at her, really looked. At the curve of her jaw, the smudge of charcoal on her cheekbone, the way her fingers curled protectively over the swell of her belly. She was not a vessel. She was not a contract. She was not a means to an end. She was the crack in his paper fortress. She was the light he had not known he was starving for. "Because I don't know what it means yet," he said. And for the first time in his adult life, Julian Ashford told the truth. He signed the temporary control documents at 3:00 p.m. Marcus left with the folder, his smile intact, his eyes cold with satisfaction. The merger would proceed without Julian's direct oversight. The board would convene in 3 days. The empire would survive. Julian did not care. He returned to Eliza's room, pulled the plastic chair to the edge of her bed, and sat down. He rested his head on the thin hospital blanket, his forehead touching the curve of her hip. He closed his eyes. He did not plan to sleep, but exhaustion was a tide, and he had been fighting it for years, and his body finally overruled his will. His breathing slowed. His shoulders dropped. The tension bled out of him like water from a cracked vessel. Eliza watched him. She did not pull away, she reached down slowly and let her fingers brush through his hair. The touch was light, tentative, a question more than an answer. He did not stir. For a long moment, she studied the man who had bought her like a commodity, who had imprisoned her in glass and steel, who had fired doctors and canceled mergers and stood in a hospital hallway and almost said a word he could not take back. Then she closed her eyes and let herself sleep. She was gone when he woke. The bed was empty. The sheets were cold. The sketchbook lay on the pillow, open to a new page, a rough drawing of a coastline, waves breaking against rocks, a single bird suspended against an infinite sky. And a note, written in charcoal, the letters smudged and hurried, "I need to see the ocean. Come alone." Julian's heart stopped. Then it started again, faster, harder, a fist pounding against the cage of his ribs. He ran. The penthouse was empty. The garage was missing his car, the black Aston Martin, the one with the GPS tracker he had installed without her knowledge. He pulled out his phone, opened the tracking app, and watched a small blue dot move south along the coastal highway toward the cliffs where the Pacific crashed against the rocks. He did not call security. He did not alert the police. He did not activate the kill switch he had built into the car's engine. He got into his secondary vehicle, a silver Mercedes, slower, less conspicuous, and he followed the dot. Not as a captor, not as a CEO, not as a man who had built an empire to fill an empty room. He followed as a man who had finally found something worth losing everything for. The road stretched ahead, gray asphalt and salt-scoured air, and the dot on his screen moved steadily toward the sea. Julian pressed the accelerator, and the engine hummed, and the city shrank in his rearview mirror like a dying star. He did not know what he would say when he found her. He did not know if she would run, or fight, or fall into his arms. He did not know if the word he had almost spoken in the hospital hallway was love or obsession or some third thing that had no name. But he knew, with a certainty that burned through the cold architecture of his soul, that he would not let her go. Not for the empire, not for the board, not for anything. The dot stopped moving, blinking at the edge of a cliff, where the land ended and the ocean began. Julian drove faster. End of Chapter 4 ***. Chapter 5. The rewriting of the fortress, the penthouse, had become a mausoleum of silence. Julian Ashford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city stretch beneath him like a circuit board, each light a transaction, each shadow a liability. He had not slept. The clock on his wrist, a Patek Philippe that cost more than most men's homes, read 4:47 a.m., but time had become meaningless. The only measurement that mattered was the absence of her. He had checked her room first. The bed was made with military precision, the sheets pulled tight, the pillows fluffed. A hospital corner. He had taught her that after the fainting incident, when the nurses had shown him how to make a bed properly. He had stood in her doorway, watching her learn, and felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the marble of his heart. Her suitcase was gone, her paintbrushes, the half-finished canvas of the city at dawn. He had called her phone 12 times. Each call went to voicemail. Her voice, recorded in a tone he had never heard her use, soft, almost playful, said, "You've reached Eliza. Leave a message and I might paint you into something beautiful." He had left no messages. What could he say? "I have your medical records. I know your blood type, your genetic markers, your family history of hypertension. I know the exact number of steps from your room to the kitchen, 47. The frequency of your breathing when you sleep, 16 breaths per minute. The way you hum when you think no one is listening, off-key, always a half step behind the melody. I know everything about you except how to keep you." Marcus Thorne had called at midnight. Julian had watched the phone vibrate on his desk, the name glowing like a warning light. He had not answered. He knew what Marcus would say. The board is concerned, Julian. Your attachment is compromising the contract. We have contingency plans. Contingency plans. Julian had written those plans. He had designed the contract like a fortress, every clause a wall, every signature a locked gate. He had built it to protect his legacy, his empire, his name. He had not anticipated that the fortress would become a prison and that the prisoner would be his own heart. He had fired the head physician at the clinic, not for negligence. The woman had been competent, even excellent. He had fired her because she had touched Eliza's wrist, had held her hand, had spoken to her in a voice that was gentle and warm, and Julian had felt a rage so pure and so terrifying that he had not recognized himself. He had stood in the hospital room, watching the doctor comfort Eliza, and had felt the world narrow to a single point. That should be me. I should be the one she turns to. I should be the one she trusts. But he had not known how. He had never learned. The cliff was an hour north of the city, a place he had discovered years ago during a rare moment of escape from his father's expectations. He had driven there once as a teenager, after his father had told him that sentiment was a weakness, that the only currency that mattered was control. Julian had stood on this same cliff, watching the waves crash against the rocks, and had felt nothing. He had been 18 years old, and he had already become the man his father wanted, cold, precise, untouchable. Now he was 38, and he was standing on the same cliff, watching the same waves, and he was terrified. She was there. Eliza stood at the edge, her coat wrapped tight around her, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The wind pulled at her hair, dark and wild, and she did not turn when she heard his footsteps. She did not flinch when he stopped beside her, close enough to touch, far enough to respect the distance she had created. "I thought you left," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, raw, unguarded, stripped of the authority he had worn like armor for 2 decades. "I needed to think." She did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a line of gray and silver. "I needed to remember who I was before I became a clause in your contract." The words hit him like a physical blow. He had read her file. He knew her history, the father who had died when she was 16, leaving her with a stack of unfinished canvases and a debt she had spent years paying off. The mother who had remarried, moved to Florida, and called once a year on Christmas. The string of apartments, each smaller than the last, each a temporary shelter in a city that did not care. He knew the statistics of her life, the data points that had made her the perfect candidate for surrogacy. No significant other, no close family, a genetic profile that matched his requirements within 0.3% deviation. He had chosen her because she was alone. He had chosen her because she would not fight back. He had been wrong. "I don't know how to do this," he said. The admission came from somewhere deep, a place he had sealed off years ago, behind walls of quarterly reports and acquisition strategies. "I don't know how to be anything else." Eliza turned to him. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Then learn." They stood in silence, watching the waves. The minutes stretched, elastic and strange, and Julian felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement, slow and inevitable, like the grinding of continents. He had spent his entire life building structures that would not move, contracts that would not bend, a fortress that would not break. But the fortress was cracking, and the cracks were letting in light. He told her about his mother. He had never told anyone. The story was buried in legal documents, sealed by NDAs, erased from the public record. His mother had been a surrogate, hired by his father to carry the Ashford heir. She had been paid, generously, and she had left the day after his birth. Julian had never seen her face, never heard her voice. He had grown up with a photograph, tucked in a drawer, that he had found when he was 12, a woman with dark hair and sad eyes, holding a baby who would never know her. "My father raised me with rules," he said. "Rules for eating, rules for sleeping, rules for speaking, rules for everything. He told me that love was a transaction, that the only thing that mattered was the balance sheet. I believed him. I made him proud." He paused, the words sticking in his throat. "He died 5 years ago. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything. I thought that meant I was strong." Eliza reached out. Her hand hovered near his, not quite touching, and he felt the heat of her skin like a brand. "What do you think now?" "I think I was wrong." His voice broke on the last word. "I think I have been wrong about everything." The drive back to the city was silent, but the silence was different now, less a void, more a space they were filling together. Eliza watched the landscape blur past, the trees giving way to suburbs, the suburbs giving way to steel and glass. Julian drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console, palm up, an invitation she did not take. When they reached the penthouse, he did not open the door for her. He stood aside, a gesture he had never made before, and let her enter first. The space felt different, less like a cage, more like a waiting room, a place between one life and another. "Come with me," he said. He led her to the east wing, a section of the penthouse she had never explored. It was empty, a vast open space with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the sea. The light was pale and silver, filtering through the glass like water through silk. "This will be your studio," he said. "Skylights for natural light, a kiln if you want to work with clay, a wall of windows facing the ocean. I will have it built to your specifications." "Whatever you need." Eliza stared at him. Her expression was unreadable, a canvas of shadows and light. "Why?" "Because you are not a vessel." The words came out before he could stop them. "You are not a clause in a contract. You are not a means to an end." He took a step toward her, then stopped, afraid of what he might do if he got too close. "I chose you because you were alone. I chose you because I thought you would not fight back. I was wrong, and I am grateful that I was wrong." She did not speak. She walked to the window, placed her palm against the glass, and looked out at the sea. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental, a claim, a possession, a declaration that this space was hers. That night, Julian did not sleep. He sat in his study, the lights off, the city glittering below him like a field of stars. He had a legal pad on his desk, a pen in his hand, and he was writing, not a contract, not a legal document, a letter. "Eliza, I do not know how to begin this. I have spent my entire life writing documents that bind people, that limit them, that reduce them to terms and conditions. I have never written anything that sets someone free. But I am trying. I will give you a trust fund, not for the child, for you, for your art. For the paintings you will create, the galleries that will hang them, the people who will see the world through your eyes. I will give you a home, not as a captive, but as a partner. I will give you my heart, even if I do not know how. Even if I am afraid. I am afraid, Eliza. I am afraid of losing you. I am afraid of the emptiness I will become if you leave. I am afraid of the man I was before you came. And I am afraid that I will never be the man you deserve. But I will try. I will learn. Yours, Julian." He folded the letter, walked to her room, and placed it on her pillow. He did not knock. He did not wait for a response. He returned to his study and sat in the dark, waiting for dawn, waiting for the moment when she would read his words and decide whether to stay or go. She found him an hour before sunrise. She stood in the doorway of his study, the letter in her hands, her eyes red from crying. She did not speak. She walked to him, knelt before his chair, and took his face in her hands. Her palms were warm, her fingers trembling, and he felt the tears on her cheeks before he saw them. "This is not a contract," she said. "It's a confession." He nodded. He could not speak. She leaned forward and kissed him. Her lips were soft, hesitant, tasting of salt and grief and something else, something that felt like hope. He did not move. He did not breathe. He let her take what she needed, and when she pulled back, he saw that she was smiling. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered, "but I want to try." They spent the night on the floor of the study, wrapped in a blanket that Julian had pulled from the back of his chair. They talked. Until the sky turned gray, then pink, then gold. She told him about her father, the way he had painted with his fingers, the way he had smelled of turpentine and coffee, the way he had dyed with a brush in his hand, leaving behind a legacy of unfinished canvases and a daughter who had never learned to let go. He told her about the first time he had felt fear, when she collapsed in the hallway, her body crumpling like a paper doll. He had stood there, frozen, for 3 full seconds, 3 seconds of absolute terror, 3 seconds in which he had understood, for the first time in his life, that there were things he could not control. "I thought I would lose you," he said. "You can't lose what you never had." She reached out, traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip. "But you can find it." The phone rang at 7:03 a.m. Julian looked at the screen. Diana Reyes. His lawyer, he answered, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Julian." Diana's voice was tight, professional, edged with urgency. "The board has filed a motion to enforce the original contract. They want Eliza out by the end of the month." He sat up, the blanket falling from his shoulders. Eliza stirred beside him, her eyes opening, her hand reaching for his. They have evidence, Diana continued. Security footage from the penthouse. They know about the hospital, they know about the studio, they know. About, she paused, they know about your relationship. Julian looked at Eliza. She was watching him, her eyes steady, her hand warm in his. He thought about the contract, the fortress he had built, the walls he had erected, the prison he had designed. He thought about his father, who had taught him that love was a weakness, that the only thing that mattered was the balance sheet. He thought about the empire, the billions, the legacy he had spent his entire life constructing. And he thought about Eliza, the way she hummed when she painted, the way she laughed when she was surprised, the way she had knelt before him, taken his face in her hands, and kissed him like he was worth saving. Let them try, he said. His voice was calm, steady, certain. I will burn the empire to the ground before I let them take her. He hung up the phone and turned to Eliza. She was smiling, her eyes bright with tears and something else, something that looked like love. Did you mean it? She asked. Every word? Yes. He took her hand, pressed it to his chest, where his heart was beating for the first time in 38 years. Every word. The sun rose over the city, painting the walls in shades of gold and amber, and Julian Ashford, the man who had built an empire on steel and glass, began to learn how to build something new. Something fragile. Something human, something worth fighting for. The city lay beneath him like a circuit board, each light a pulse in the machine of his making. Julian Ashford stood at the window of his private office, a glass-walled eyrie suspended 40 stories above Manhattan, and watched the traffic flow through arteries of steel and concrete. His reflection hung transparent against the night, a specter in a $6,000 suit, his jaw set hard as the titanium frame of the building itself. Behind him, on his desk, lay the dossier. He had told himself it was due diligence. The child would inherit his name, his empire, his blood. It was reasonable, necessary, to know the genetic landscape. The private investigator, a former MI6 operative named Corrigan, had delivered the file with the clinical efficiency Julian demanded. Now the folder sat open, its contents bleeding across the polished mahogany like a wound he could not stop pressing. Daniel Marchetti, gallery owner, Soho, 3-year relationship, ended amicably 18 months prior. The photograph showed a man with salt and pepper hair and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He was older than Julian had expected, handsomer. He stood beside Eliza in front of a canvas, her head tilted back in laughter, her throat exposed like a column of cream. Julian's fingers traced the image, and the paper browned slightly under the heat of his skin. He turned the page. Marcus Chen, sculptor, brief entanglement, 6 weeks, no residual contact. Liam Foster, photographer, 2 months, ended after Eliza relocated to Brooklyn. Each name was a small blade, and Julian catalogued them with the precision of a coroner. He memorized the dates, the durations, the reasons for dissolution. He noted that none of them had lasted, none had held her. A cold satisfaction bloomed in his chest. She was not easy to keep. She was not meant to be kept, and yet here she was in his penthouse under his contract carrying his seed. He closed the folder and pressed the intercom. Corrigan, he said, his voice flat as a blade, I want surveillance on the penthouse. Common areas only, discreet. Understood, Mr. Ashford. I'll have a team install the equipment tonight. No team, you alone, and no record of the installation. A pause. Understood. Julian ended the call and turned back to the window. The city glittered, indifferent and vast. He had built this kingdom with his own hands, had clawed his way through boardroom battles and hostile takeovers, had left men broken in his wake. He had never once felt the need to watch, to monitor. But the dossier had opened a door in his mind, and through it, he saw Eliza not as she was now, pregnant, compliant, bound by contract, but as she had been, laughing in a gallery, barefoot in a sculptor's loft, her hair tangled on a photographer's pillow. The thought was a chemical burn. The cameras arrived in a leather briefcase, and Julian installed them himself after midnight when Eliza slept. He worked in silence, his hands steady, his movements precise. One in the corner of the living room, disguised as a smoke detector. One in the kitchen, embedded in the range hood. One in the hallway, hidden behind a sconce. The feed streamed to a tablet he kept in his office, and when he returned to his desk at 3 a.m, he opened the application and watched. The penthouse was still. The lights were dimmed to amber, the furniture arranged in the minimalist geometry he had designed. But something was different. A scarf, her scarf, a splash of cobalt wool, hung over the back of a chair. A half-empty mug sat on the coffee table, a ring of tea staining the marble. On the counter, a tube of ultramarine paint lay uncapped, its contents drying in a small blue pool. He should have been furious. His space, his sanctuary, defiled by entropy. Instead, he found himself zooming the camera in on the paint, studying the way it curled at the edges, the tiny ridges where the air had begun to crack the surface. He imagined her hand leaving it there, careless and alive. He imagined the sound of the cap clicking open, the scent of pigment rising. He watched for hours. The first test came the next morning. Eliza appeared in the living room at 9, her hair loose, her body wrapped in a silk robe the color of old roses. She moved slowly, her hand resting on her belly, a gesture that was becoming habitual, unconscious. Julian watched from his tablet as she walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and then stopped. She looked up, directly at the smoke detector. Her eyes held it for a long moment, and Julian felt a chill travel the length of his spine. She couldn't know. The lens was microscopic, the housing identical to the building's existing fixtures. But she stared, and then she smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips, and turned away. She began to hum. An off-key melody, something folk and wandering, as she pulled out her art supplies and spread them across the kitchen island. She uncapped a jar of turpentine, and the scent bloomed through the camera's audio. He could almost smell it, sharp and chemical and asterisk her asterisk. She dipped a brush and began to paint on a scrap of canvas, her movements loose and unhurried. She was performing. He knew it with a clarity that should have angered him. She was testing the invisible gaze, daring it to react. She left her brushes unwashed, the turpentine uncapped, the paint smeared on the marble. She danced, a slow, swaying motion, her bare feet tracing arcs on the cold floor, and Julian watched, his knuckles white around the tablet, his breath shallow. He wanted to go down there. He wanted to take her face in his hands and demand to know what she was doing, who she was becoming, why she was dismantling his world with such casual grace. But he did not move. He watched. Daniel Marchetti arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Julian saw him first on the lobby camera, a tall figure in a linen blazer, carrying a portfolio tube. The doorman announced him, and Julian's hand moved to the intercom before he could stop it. He could deny entry. He could claim medical rest, legal protocol, the 1,000 clauses of the contract that gave him dominion over her environment. But he did not. Instead, he watched. Eliza opened the door with a smile that Julian had never seen, open, unguarded, her whole face softening like wax near a flame. She embraced Daniel, her arms sliding around his neck, and Julian's vision tunneled. The tablet trembled. In his grip, he watched them move to the living room, watched Daniel unroll sketches across the coffee table, watched Eliza lean close, her hair brushing his shoulder. They spoke in low tones, their laughter rising and falling like tide. Daniel touched her arm once, a brief, familiar gesture, and Julian saw red. He was descending before he knew he had moved. The elevator seemed to crawl, each second a small eternity. He stepped into the penthouse without announcing himself, his footsteps silent on the marble, and when he entered the living room, both of them looked up. Eliza's smile faded. Daniel's hand withdrew. "Julian," she said, and her voice was careful, measured. "This is Daniel Marchetti. He's a gallery owner. We're discussing a potential exhibition." Julian did not look at Daniel. His eyes were fixed on Eliza, on the faint flush in her cheeks, the way her fingers curled around the edge of the canvas. "You didn't mention a visitor. I didn't know I needed permission. You're under contract, medical protocols, stress management." His voice was silk over steel, each word a blade wrapped in velvet. "I would have thought you'd inform me of any disruptions to your schedule." Daniel stood, his posture diplomatic. "Mr. Ashford, I apologize for the intrusion. Eliza and I have a professional history, and when she mentioned she was working again, I wanted to see her new pieces. I can return at a more convenient time. You can leave now." The words hung in the air, flat and final. Daniel glanced at Eliza and she gave a small, tight nod. He gathered his sketches, his portfolio, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. "Eliza, call me when you're free. The offer stands." The door closed. The silence that followed was thick as glass. Eliza turned to Julian, and he saw something in her eyes he had not seen before. Not fear, not defiance, but a cold, assessing anger. "You had no right. I have every right. The contract is a document. It is not a soul." She stepped closer, and he did not move. "You cannot own me, Julian. You can rent my body for 9 months, but you cannot own my past, my friendships, my life *. You are carrying my child. And that gives you dominion over every breath I take? Her voice cracked, and he saw the tremor in her hands. I will not be a prisoner in this glass cage. I will not be watched. His jaw tightened. The words were forming before he could stop them, rising from a place he had sealed years ago, behind steel. And concrete and non-disclosure agreements. I didn't contract for this. For what? For ***. The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. He saw her eyes widen, saw the shift in her posture, the sudden awareness that the ground beneath them had changed. I contracted for an heir, he continued, his voice low, almost a whisper. For a genetic legacy, for a transaction that would leave me untouched. But you, he stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. You are in my skin, you are in my ***head***. I watch you sleep. I smell your paint on my clothes. I cannot stop thinking about you. She took a step back. That's not love, Julian, that's obsession. I don't know the difference. He reached for her and she flinched. The motion was small, almost imperceptible, but it shattered something inside him. He grabbed the nearest object, a crystal glass, heavy and cold, and hurled it at the marble floor. The shatter was a gunshot. Shards exploded across the room, catching the winter light like scattered diamonds. Julian stepped through the glittering wreckage, his shoes crunching on the fragments until his face was inches from hers. You are mine, he said, and his voice was barely a breath. The contract was a lie. I need you. Eliza stood frozen, her breath shallow, her hands pressed to her belly. He saw the monster in her eyes, the tyrant who would cage her, the architect of her confinement. But beneath that, he saw something else, a flicker of recognition. She saw the boy behind the Titan, the child abandoned by a mother who had signed him away for a price. She retreated. Step by step, her bare feet carrying her backward, away from the glass and the blood and the man who had just handed her the keys to his destruction. She reached her door, turned the lock, and disappeared. Julian stood alone in the silence. He knelt slowly and began to pick up the glass. The shards bit into his fingers, and he watched the blood well, dark and thick, without feeling it. He gathered piece after piece, his hands trembling, his breath ragged, until the floor was clean and his palms were lacerated. He did not know how long he stayed there. The light shifted from white to amber to gray. The city hummed below, indifferent and vast. And when he finally rose, he found a smear of turpentine on his suit sleeve, a scent that clung to him, that followed him into the elevator, into his office, into the long, sleepless hours of the night. He dreamed of her crying. The sound was muffled, distant, but it cut through the layers of his consciousness like a blade. He woke in his office chair, the tablet dark on his lap, and realized the sound was real. It came through the walls, through the vents, a soft, broken rhythm that twisted something deep in his chest. He stood. He walked to the elevator. He descended. Her door was closed, the light beneath it a thin line of gold. He stood outside, his hand raised, his knuckles hovering an inch from the wood. He could knock. He could demand entry. He could use the contract, the legal clauses, the 1,000 justifications that his mind supplied. But he did not. He stood there, his hand frozen, as the first snow of winter began to fall against the penthouse windows. Flakes clung to the glass, white and silent, and he watched them accumulate, layer upon layer, burying the city in a cold, clean shroud. Her crying softened, grew slower. And then silence. Julian lowered his hand. He pressed his palm flat against the door, feeling the wood, the warmth, the impossible distance between his skin and hers. He did not leave. He stayed until the snow covered the skyline, until the city became a blank page, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. And still, he did not knock. Chapter 7. The boy behind the Titan *. The dawn came pale and thin, like milk diluted with water, seeping through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Eliza stood in the guest room. She refused to call it hers *, and folded a sweater with the kind of deliberate precision that masked something breaking inside her. She had not slept. The city below hummed with the machinery of lives she did not belong to, and somewhere in that steel and glass labyrinth, Julian Ashford was already awake, already moving through his rituals of control. 4:30, workout, shower, black coffee. The empire fed on his discipline, and she had become just another clause in its ledger. Her hands moved slowly. A dress. A sketchbook. The single tube of cadmium red she had smuggled past his security team when she first arrived, hidden in the lining of her coat like a talisman. She did not hear him approach. "You're leaving." His voice was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat precision he used in boardrooms when announcing quarterly losses. But there was something beneath it, a crack. Hairline thin, that she might have missed if she had not spent the last 6 months learning the topography of his silences. She did not turn around. "The contract allows for termination before the second trimester. I checked." "You checked. I'm not a fool, Julian." The silence stretched between them like a wire-pulled taut. She could feel him in the doorway, a presence of tailored wool and restrained fury, and she wondered if he would simply let her go. That would be the cleanest outcome, the most efficient, the most Julian asterisk. But when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The edges were gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded, a voice he had never used in any negotiation. "Tell me why." She finally turned. He stood in the threshold, his hands at his sides, his tie loosened as if he had been pulling at it all night. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and she realized with a start that he looked tired, not the exhaustion of a man who had worked too many hours, but the hollowed-out fatigue of someone who had not slept. "Either why?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I am a vessel to you, a biological receptacle with a heartbeat. Because you have reduced my body to a timeline, ovulation, implantation, gestation, and I have become a stranger to myself. Because I dream of turpentine and wake up smelling antiseptic. Because you watch me the way you watch your quarterly reports, waiting for the numbers to align." She took a step toward him, her anger rising like a tide. "You want to know why? Because I am tired of being a transaction." Julian flinched. It was subtle, a micro-movement, a tightening of his jaw, but she caught it. And in that flinch she saw something she had never seen in him before, vulnerability. "Come with me," he said. "Where?" "There is something you need to see." The hidden study was not hidden by any lock or secret passage. It was hidden in plain sight, behind a door she had passed 100 times, a door she had assumed led to a storage closet or a secondary utility room. But when Julian pressed his palm to a panel beside the frame, the door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a space that seemed to belong to a different man entirely. It was small, intimate. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with a name and a date in Julian's own handwriting. A single desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers and photographs, and the air smelled of old paper and dust. The scent of secrets kept too long. Eliza stepped inside, her breath catching. "What is this?" Julian closed the door behind them. The sound of the lock engaging was soft, but it felt like a sentence. "This is where I keep the truth," he said. He moved to the nearest cabinet, his fingers trembling as he pulled open a drawer. He removed a file, thick, worn at the edges, the paper yellowed with age, and placed it on the desk. His hands hovered over it for a moment, as if he were about to perform a ritual he had done 1,000 times before. "I was 32 when I found this," he said, "after my father died. He left me everything, the company, the holdings, the estates, but he also left me this, in a safe deposit box, with instructions that I was not to open it until after his funeral." He opened the file. Inside, Eliza saw a birth certificate, her name, a surrogacy contract, signed by a man she recognized from photographs as Julian's father, and a woman named Clara Vance. Clara Vance. The name struck her like a blow. "I was a transaction," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father wanted an heir. He did not want a wife, so he found a woman, a struggling artist like you, and he paid her to carry me. She signed away all rights. She agreed to never contact me, never seek me out, never reveal the truth of my origin." He pulled out a photograph, a woman with dark hair and sad eyes standing in front of a canvas. She was young, beautiful. She looked, Eliza realized with a jolt of recognition, familiar asterisk. "She vanished after I was born. My father told me my mother died in childbirth. He told me that. For 32 years, and when I found this file, I hired investigators to find her." Julian's voice broke. "She died 10 years ago, alone, in a studio apartment in Paris. She never stopped painting, but she never sold a single piece. She had my face in a frame on her nightstand. She had kept me, even though she was never allowed to know me." Eliza felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. "I never knew her voice," Julian said. I never knew if she hummed when she painted. I never knew if she left her brushes in the sink or if she burned her toast in the morning. I never knew anything about her except that she was paid to give me life, and then she was erased. He looked at Eliza, and his eyes were wet. When I saw your profile, your genetic markers, your medical history, your resemblance to her, I thought I was being rational. I thought I was choosing the optimal candidate, but I was choosing my mother. I was trying to rewrite a story I could never change. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. He placed it on the desk beside the file. This is a new contract, he said. I had my lawyers draft it last night. It transfers the east wing of this penthouse into your name. It establishes a trust fund, not for the child, but for you asterisk. It guarantees your freedom to leave at any time, to pursue your art, to live your life without obligation. It is not a cage. It is a gift. He pushed it toward her. Stay, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. Not because of the contract, not because of the child. Stay because I am asking you. Stay because I do not know how to be anything other than this, cold, controlled, broken, but I am trying. Stay because I see you, Eliza, and I am terrified of losing you. Eliza looked at the document. Then she looked at the photograph of Clara. Then she looked at Julian, the titan, the billionaire, the man who had built an empire on precision and control, and she saw him for what he truly was, a boy, abandoned, afraid, desperate to be chosen. She picked up the contract. She held it in her hands, feeling the weight of his offering, the weight of his trust. And then, slowly, deliberately, she tore it in half. The paper fluttered to the floor like snow. I will stay, she said, but not because of this, because I see asterisk you asterisk. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his cheek. He flinched as if burned, but he did not pull away. His eyes closed, and she felt the tension in his jaw, the tremble in his breath. You are not a transaction, she said. You never were. That afternoon, Julian returned from an errand she had not asked about. He carried a canvas, the finest he could find, stretched and primed, the linen smooth as silk, and a set of brushes, each one handcrafted, their handles warm with the promise of creation. He set them in the doorway of the east wing, which he had ordered cleared and cleaned. He did not enter. He simply stood there, watching as Eliza approached, her fingers reaching for the brushes with a reverence she had not felt in months. She looked at him. He nodded once, a small gesture, and then he stepped back. She began to paint. Her strokes were tentative at first, uncertain, as if she had forgotten how to trust her own hand. But slowly, the rhythm returned. The cadmium red bled across the canvas, and she felt something inside her unclench, a muscle she had held tight since the day she signed that first contract. Julian watched from the doorway. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply breathed the scent of turpentine, and for the first time in his life, it did not smell like chaos. It smelled like home. The letter arrived 3 days later. It was delivered by hand, in an envelope of cream-colored paper, sealed with a wax crest that Julian recognized immediately. He had seen it before, on love letters he had burned and on legal documents he had shredded. It was the mark of Isabel Morrow, the woman he had once almost married, the woman who knew him before the armor. He did not open it. He set it on the hall table, intending to discard it later, but Eliza found it first. She was on her way to the studio, her fingers stained with ultramarine, when she noticed the envelope. The wax crest caught the light. The handwriting was elegant, looping, feminine. She picked it up. She hesitated. And then, because she was not the kind of woman who let secrets fester, she slid her finger beneath the seal and pulled out the letter. The first line was written in ink the color of dried blood. Julian, I know about the child. Eliza's breath stopped. The letter trembled in her hands. And somewhere in the penthouse, the elevator doors opened, and she heard Julian's footsteps on the marble floor. She looked up. He was standing in the hallway, his coat still on, his eyes fixed on the letter in her hands. Eliza, he said. His voice was calm, but his face was pale. Let me explain. But she was already reading the second line. I know everything. Chapter 8. The ghost of winter. The elevator chimed like a death knell. Julian felt it before he heard it. A shift in the penthouse's oxygen, a disturbance in the sterile air he had curated for 15 years. He was at his desk, reviewing the quarterly projections for AethelCorp's Asian markets, when the doors parted and Isabel Morrow stepped into his foyer as though she owned it. She always had that talent, occupying space like a conqueror. Julian, her voice was honey over broken glass. You look well, retirement suits you. He did not rise. His fingers remained still on the keyboard, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. Isabel, you're not on my schedule. Am I ever? She smiled, a practiced curve of crimson lips, and let her coat fall open. Beneath it, a dress the color of dried blood. She had always known how to dress for impact. I was in the building. Marcus mentioned you'd been occupied. I had to see for myself. Marcus Thorne, of course, the bored serpent coiling in the shadows, waiting for Julian's armor to crack. Before Julian could respond, the sound of bare feet on marble announced Eliza's arrival. She emerged from the hallway, a paintbrush still tucked behind her ear, her oversized sweater swallowing her frame. Her belly, rounded now, a visible testament to the life growing inside her, preceded her like a declaration of war. Isabel's gaze dropped to it, lingered, and then lifted to meet Eliza's eyes with surgical precision. You must be the surrogate. Isabel extended a hand, fingers glittering with diamonds. Isabel Morrow, Julian and I go back, way back. Eliza did not take the hand. She looked at Julian instead. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut. Eliza, Julian said, his voice carefully neutral, this is an old business associate. She was just leaving. Was I? Isabel laughed, a sound like breaking china. I thought we might catch up, over drinks or tea in your case. She nodded toward Eliza's belly. When are you due? Spring, Eliza said. The single word was a wall. How lovely. New life new. Beginnings? Isabel's smile didn't reach her eyes. Julian always did prefer the transactional approach to family. Cleaner, no messy emotions. The air thickened. Julian rose from his desk, a slow, deliberate movement that commanded the room. Isabel, my office, now. He crossed to her, took her elbow with a grip that brooked no argument, and guided her toward the study. Before the door closed, Eliza caught a glimpse of Isabel's face, not anger, but something far more dangerous, pity. The study was soundproofed. Julian had designed it that way. You have 30 seconds, he said, releasing her arm. Then I call security. Isabel circled his desk, her fingers trailing over the leather chair. You've changed the furniture. I remember when you had that Eames lounger. The one 20 seconds. She turned, and for a moment the mask slipped. Beneath the polish and the poison, there was something raw, something wounded. I lost the baby, Julian, our baby. Do you remember that? The words hit him like a blade between the ribs. I remember. His voice was quieter now. I was there. Were you? She laughed, but it caught in her throat. You were in Hong Kong, closing a deal. I called you 12 times. You answered on the 13th, told me to call a car, and hung up. The car came. You didn't. The memory surfaced like a body from a frozen lake, the phone in his hand, the spreadsheet on his screen, the numbers that mattered more than her tears. He had been a machine then. A beautiful, efficient, soulless machine. What do you want, Isabel? Nothing. She smoothed her dress. I came to warn you, you think you've changed. You think this girl, this artist with her paint-stained fingers and her quiet rebellion has cracked something open in you. But I know you, Julian. I know the architecture of your heart. It's built from steel and contracts. She's a phase, a diversion. And when the child is born, you'll do what you always do, reduce the human to a line item. You don't know her. I don't need to. I know you. She walked to the door, paused, and looked back. I'm at the Ritz until Friday. If you want to remember what it felt like to be human, you know where to find me. The door clicked shut. Julian stood alone in the silence, the ghost of a winter he thought he had buried pressing cold against his spine. Eliza was in the studio when he found her. The easel was angled toward the window, the canvas a chaos of black and crimson. Her strokes were jagged, violent, a storm rendered in oil. She didn't look up when he entered, but her hand trembled as she pressed the brush to the canvas. Who is she? Julian closed the door behind him. Someone I used to be. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Eliza set down the brush and turned. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she had not cried. She was stronger than that, stronger than he had ever been. Did you love her? The question hung between them. Like a blade, yes, the word cost him, but I didn't know how. I was incapable of it. I treated her like a transaction, like I treated everyone. And now, her voice cracked. Are you capable now? He crossed the room, stopped a breath away from her. He could smell the turpentine on her skin, the faint salt of her sweat. She was so real, so achingly, terrifyingly real. I don't know, he admitted. But I want to be, for you, for the baby. Her hand rose, hesitated, and then pressed against his chest. Your heart is racing. I know. Good, she whispered. I want you to feel it. Every time you think of her, every time you doubt, I want you to feel this. She stepped back, picked up her brush, and returned to the canvas. The conversation was over. The gala was a fortress of ice and champagne. AethelCorp's winter fundraiser, held in a glass pavilion overlooking the frozen Hudson. Eliza wore a dress Julian had chosen, deep blue velvet, with a cut that accommodated her growing belly and felt like a fraud among the glittering predators. Isabel found her in the restroom. The door swung open, and there she was, adjusting her earrings in the mirror as though they were old friends sharing a quiet moment. You look beautiful, Isabel said. He has good taste. He always did. Eliza said nothing. She focused on the sink, on the water running over her hands, on the cold porcelain grounding her. He will use you up, Eliza. Isabel's voice dropped to a whisper. He will take the child and leave you with nothing but a check. I know, because he did it to me. You lost the baby. Eliza turned off the tap. That's not the same, isn't it? Isabel met her eyes in the mirror. I was a vessel, Eliza, a means to an end. And when the vessel broke, he discarded it. You think because you're still intact, you're different? You're not, you're just more useful. The words lodged in Eliza's chest like shrapnel. I don't believe you. Then ask him about Capri. Ask him about the summer we spent in that villa, when he told me he loved me, when he promised me a future. Ask him how long it took him to reduce that promise to a settlement. Isabel smoothed her dress, smiled her perfect smile, and walked out. Eliza stood alone in the white-tiled silence, her hands pressed to her belly, the child kicking softly against her palm. She found him in the winter garden, a glass enclosure filled with dormant rose bushes, their thorny branches reaching toward a sky heavy with snow. Julian stood at the far end, his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the floodlights. Did you love her? He turned. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. I told you, I was incapable. That's not what I asked. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the cold air. Did you love her? A long pause, the snow fell in silence beyond the glass. Yes, the word was barely audible, but I destroyed her. I was a machine, Eliza. I didn't know how to be anything else. And now? He crossed to her, stopped inches away. His hand rose, hovered near her cheek, but did not touch. Now I am terrified, every day, of failing you, of failing our child, of becoming the man I was. His voice broke. I cannot undo my past, but I can burn it. Tell me to send her away, and I will never speak her name again. Eliza looked into his eyes, those cold, gray eyes that had once held nothing but contracts and calculations. Now they held her, just her. Then do it. Julian pulled out his phone. His thumb moved across the screen. His voice, when he spoke, was ice. Isabel, you will leave New York by morning. You will not contact me again. If you do, my legal team will treat it as harassment. This is not a negotiation. He hung up. The phone disappeared into his pocket. Done. Eliza exhaled, the tension in her shoulders released, but something else remained, a splinter of doubt lodged deep. Thank you, she whispered. Julian took her hand, pressed it to his chest. I will spend the rest of my life earning your trust. I know that. I accept that. They stood in the winter garden, surrounded by sleeping roses, as the snow fell and the city glittered cold and indifferent beyond the glass. The next morning, a courier arrived. Eliza was alone in the penthouse, Julian at a board meeting. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, a genetic test report marked with a red flag, a marker for a rare disorder, one that could threaten the child's life. The sender's name was blocked, but the postmark was from a clinic in Capri. The same clinic Isabel had visited years ago when she lost Julian's child. Eliza's hand trembled as she read the report again. The baby kicked. The snow began to melt outside the window, a false spring promising nothing but more winter to come. Chapter 9. The cradle of fear, the specialist's office smelled of antiseptic and expensive leather, a scent Julian knew intimately. It was the smell of boardrooms, of contracts signed in bloodless ink, of decisions made with the cold precision of a scalpel. But today, the scalpel was aimed at something he could not insulate with clauses or indemnify with fine print. Eliza sat in the chair beside him, her hands folded over the gentle swell of her belly. She wore a simple linen dress the color of wheat, her hair loose and wild, as if she had just stepped out of her studio. There was paint beneath her fingernails, cobalt blue, he noticed, the same shade she had used that morning to capture the light falling across the breakfast table. He had watched her from the doorway, coffee cooling in his hand, mesmerized by the way she tilted her head when she mixed colors, as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. The doctor, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, pulled up the genetic panel on a screen the size of a small television. Julian had demanded the most comprehensive analysis available. He had flown in a team from Zurich, bypassed every waiting list, paid fees that would have funded a small country's healthcare system for a year. Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Vance, the doctor began, her voice carefully neutral, the panel has identified a marker. It's rare but not unheard of. A 15% probability of a degenerative neuromuscular condition that could manifest within the first 18 months of life. The numbers hung in the air like smoke. Julian's mind, trained to calculate risk and reward, seized on the statistic. 85%. The child would be healthy 85% of the time. Those were excellent odds. He would bet on those odds. He had built an empire on thinner margins. 15%, he repeated, his voice flat. That's a 1 in 6 chance. We need a second opinion, a third. I want the raw data sent to Johns Hopkins, to the Charité in Berlin, to Julian. Eliza's voice cut through his spiral, soft but unyielding. She did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the doctor, steady and clear. What does the marker actually mean? Not the statistics, the reality. The doctor's expression softened just slightly. It means there is a genetic variation that in some cases has been associated with the condition, but associated is not determined. Many children with this marker develop perfectly normally. The body is not a contract, Mrs. Vance. It does not always follow the fine print. Eliza nodded slowly, then she turned to Julian, and he saw something in her eyes that he could not name, a calm that unsettled him more than the diagnosis. I want the raw data, she said. I want to see it myself. He wanted to argue. He wanted to lock her in a room with the best doctors in the world until they had answers, certainties, guarantees. But the word guarantee had never existed in his vocabulary, not really. He had simply pretended it did. I'll have it sent to your tablet within the hour, the doctor said. That night, Julian stood in the doorway of Eliza's studio, watching her work. She had spread the genetic data across her drafting table like a map of foreign territory, charts and sequences and rows of letters that meant nothing to him but seemed to speak to her in a language of their own. She had printed the images of cells, magnified 1,000 times, and taped them to the wall in a grid. And now she was painting. Her brush moved with a rhythm he had never seen before, not the careful, deliberate strokes of her landscapes, but something faster, more urgent. She was painting cells, dividing, multiplying, splitting apart and coming together. Each one a question mark. Each one a prayer. The turpentine smell filled the room, sharp and clean. He had grown used to it now, the way he had grown used to the sound of her humming in the kitchen, the sight of her bare feet on his marble floors, the mess of her existence bleeding into the sterile order of his life. You're staring, she said, without turning around. I'm watching. There's a difference. He stepped into the room, his shoes making no sound on the drop cloths she had spread across the floor. I don't know what to do, he admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He never admitted such things, he never had to. He paid people to know what to do. Eliza paused, her brush hovering over the canvas. You don't have to do anything, Julian, that's the point. I can fix this. She turned to face him then, and he saw the exhaustion beneath her calm, the fear she had been holding at bay, the same fear that was eating him alive. You can't fix genetics, you can't negotiate with biology, you can't write a contract that guarantees a perfect outcome. I can find the best doctors, the best facilities. You can be here. She set down her brush and walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the canvas. She stopped inches away, close enough that he could smell the paint on her skin, the salt of her sweat, the faint sweetness of the tea she had been drinking. That's all I need from you. Be here, don't try to control it. He wanted to tell her that control was the only language he knew, that without it he was nothing, a boy abandoned in a cold house, waiting for a mother who never came back. That the empire, the steel and glass tower, the billions of dollars, all of it was just a fortress he had built to keep the chaos out. But he said none of that. Instead, he nodded. He found her at 3 a.m, sitting on the floor of the nursery. The crib was assembled. He had done it himself, refusing to let the interior designers touch it, but it was empty. Boxes of baby clothes were stacked against the walls, unopened. A rocking chair sat in the corner, still wrapped in plastic. Eliza was holding the sonogram photo, the one from their last appointment. The tiny shape of their child curled like a question mark in the darkness of her body. "I cannot lose this," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. He had not meant to speak. The words had escaped without permission, like prisoners breaking free from a cell. She looked up at him, and he saw that she had been crying. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tears she had not bothered to wipe away. "I cannot lose you," he whispered. He had never said those words to anyone. Not his father, who had died alone in a hospital bed while Julian closed a merger in Tokyo. Not the women who had passed through his life like seasons, leaving no trace. Not even himself in the darkest hours of the night when the silence of his penthouse felt like a tomb. Eliza reached up and took his hand, pulling him down to the floor beside her. He sank onto the carpet, his tailored suit crumpling, his carefully maintained composure unraveling like a thread. "Then stop trying to control it," she said, her voice soft but firm. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hair brushing his cheek. "Just be here." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. The sonogram photo lay in her lap, the tiny shape of their child a promise and a threat all at once. "I don't know how," he admitted. She laughed, a small, broken sound. "Neither do I, but we can figure it out together." They fell asleep like that, on the nursery floor, surrounded by unopened boxes and the ghost of a future they were too afraid to name. The city lights glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, cold and distant, but here, in this small, unfinished room, there was warmth. Morning came in shades of gray and gold. Julian woke first, his neck stiff, his arm numb beneath Eliza's weight. He looked down at her, asleep against his chest, her face peaceful in a way it never was when she was awake. The sonogram photo had slipped from her fingers and lay on the carpet beside them. He picked it up, studying the blurry image. Their child. A life he had tried to engineer, to control, to reduce to a contract and a timeline. And now, for the first time, he understood that he had never had any control at all. He pulled out his phone and canceled his meetings for the week. He called the clinic and scheduled a second opinion, but this time, he asked Eliza what she wanted before he confirmed the appointment. She woke slowly, blinking against the morning light. "What time is it?" "Late," he said. "Or early, depends on how you look at it." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Did you sleep?" "A little." "Liar." But she was smiling. He helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her. "Lower back. The clinic called. They can see us tomorrow morning, but I told them we'd confirm." She looked at him, surprised. "You want my opinion?" "I want your input," he said, correcting himself. "I want to know what you think is best." She was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her belly. "I want to wait," she said finally. "I don't want to do any invasive tests until we have to. I want to let the pregnancy progress, see how things develop naturally. And if something goes wrong, then we'll face it together." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "But I won't let fear dictate every decision. I won't let this consume us before it has to." He wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to plan, to prepare for every possible outcome. But he had promised himself in the darkness of the nursery that he would try to be different. "Okay," he said. She blinked. "Okay, okay." He placed his hand on her belly, feeling the faint flutter of life beneath his palm. "We wait." A week later, a package arrived. It was small, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Eliza found it on the kitchen counter, tucked between a vase of white roses and Julian S. Morning coffee. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling for reasons she could not name. Inside was a painting, small, no larger than a sheet of paper. A mother and child walked toward a lighthouse in a storm, the waves crashing around them, the light cutting through the darkness like a promise. The brushwork was raw, almost clumsy in places, but there was something in the way the light fell on the mother's face, the way the child's hand reached for hers, that made Eliza's breath catch. She turned the canvas over. An inscription, written in ink that had smudged in places, as if the writer's hand had been shaking, "For the harbor I never knew I needed." She recognized the handwriting. She had seen it on contracts, on legal briefs, on the notes he left for his staff, but she had never seen it like this, vulnerable, uncertain, reaching. She looked up to find Julian standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face unreadable. "You paint," she said. It was not a question. "I used to," he said. "Before, I haven't in years." "Why did you stop?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because it reminded me that I was human. She looked down at the painting again, at the lighthouse cutting through the storm, at the mother and child walking toward the light. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's not very good. I didn't say it was technically perfect. I said it was beautiful." He stepped into the room, his footsteps hesitant, as if he were approaching something fragile. "I wanted you to have it, in case you ever need to remember that there's a harbor, even in the storm." She set the painting down carefully, as if it were made of glass. Then she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his chest. He stiffened for a moment, surprised. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not say anything. He did not have to. Outside, the city hummed with the noise of a million lives, a million contracts, a million fortresses built against the dark. But here, in this small kitchen, surrounded by the scent of turpentine and the promise of a storm, two people held on to each other as if the world were ending. And perhaps, in a way, it was. The old world, the one of steel and glass and paper fortresses, was crumbling. And something new, fragile, uncertain, terrifying, was rising from the ruins. Chapter 10, The Harbor of Unspoken Things. The painting was a wound in her hands. Eliza stood in the doorway of Julian's private study, the canvas tilted against her chest like a shield. She had found it in the recycling chute, a discarded attempt, half-finished, the turpentine still wet in the corners. It was a study of light through glass, the way the morning sun fractured across the penthouse floor, but there was something else in the brushwork, a tenderness that did not belong to the man who had signed her into existence. Julian looked up from his laptop, the screen's blue glow carving shadows into his face. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a rare concession to the hour. The clock on his desk read 11:47 p.m. "You went through my trash," he said, but there was no accusation in it, only a weariness that made the words feel like a confession. "You painted this." Eliza stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. "When?" He closed the laptop with a soft click. The silence that followed was the kind that accumulates in empty rooms, in locked closets, in the spaces between what a man says and what he means. "A hobby," he said. "From before." "Before what?" He stood, and for a moment she saw him calculate the distance to the door, the trajectory of escape, but he did not move. Instead, he walked to a section of the wall she had always assumed was paneling and pressed his palm against it. A latch clicked and the wall swung open. The closet was small, no larger than a servant's quarters, but it was filled with canvases stacked like fallen leaves. Eliza set down her painting and stepped inside. The air smelled of oil paint and dust and something else, the scent of a man hiding from himself. She pulled out the first canvas, an empty room, a single chair, a window that looked out onto a gray sky. The second, a frozen lake, the ice cracked in patterns that spelled a name she could not read. The third, a figure in rain standing under a street lamp, his face turned away. "Is this you?" she asked. Julian stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. "It was, 20 years ago. Why did you stop?" "Because my father told me that art was for women and children. That a man builds empires, not paintings." He laughed, a sound without humor. "I believed him. For 20 years I believed him." Eliza pulled out another canvas and her breath caught. It was her. Her hands resting on the kitchen counter, the tendons visible beneath the skin. Her hair spilled across a pillow, the light catching the red undertones. The curve of her back as she slept, the sheets pooled at her waist. "You painted me," she whispered. "I couldn't stop." His voice was raw, stripped of its corporate polish. "When you moved in, I tried to ignore it. The way you moved through the penthouse like you were already leaving. The way you hummed when you painted. The way you left your coffee cup in the sink and I would pick it up and it was still warm." He paused. "I started painting you the third night you were here. I told myself it was research, a study in form, but it was never that." Eliza turned to face him. The winter light from the study's windows caught his features, softening the hard lines of his face. For the first time, she saw the boy he had been, the one who had been told that his hands were only good for building, never for creating. "Show me," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Show me how you paint, right now." She took his hand, his paint-stained hand, she noticed now, the pigment embedded in the cuticles, and led him out of the closet, through the penthouse, to the studio she had claimed in the East Wing. The room was filled with her own works, abstracts in progress, studies of the city's skyline, a portrait of a woman who looked like her mother. She set up 2 easels side by side and placed blank canvases on each. She handed him a brush. He started. Don't think, she said. Just paint. They worked in silence. The winter light faded from gray to gold to amber, the city outside flickering to life in a constellation of windows. Eliza painted a garden, wild and overgrown, the flowers spilling beyond the borders of the canvas. Julian painted a harbor, the water dark and still, a single boat moored at the dock. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His shoulders, usually rigid with control, had softened. His hand moved with a fluency that spoke of muscle memory, of a language he had been forced to forget. He was not painting the harbor, he was painting the loneliness of it, the waiting, the hope that someone would come. She flicked her brush at his canvas. A spray of blue landed across his harbor, turning the water into a sky. He looked up, startled. Then, slowly, a sound emerged from his chest, a rusty, unpracticed laugh. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, truly laugh, and it transformed his face. The mask of the CEO cracked, and beneath it was a man who had forgotten how to be young. He flicked his brush back at her canvas. Green splattered across her garden, turning the grass into a field. They painted together in the dying light, their laughter filling the studio like a language they were inventing in real time. When the sun had fully set, and the room was lit only by the city's glow, Julian set down his brush. "I have something to show you," he said. He left the room and returned with a canvas wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the easel and stepped back. Eliza unwrapped it slowly, her fingers trembling. It was her. Pregnant, standing in a field of wildflowers, her face turned toward the light. The light was not the cold, clinical light of the penthouse. It was the light of dawn, of beginning, of something holy. Her hands rested on her belly, and in the painting, she was not a vessel, not a contract, not a means to an end. She was a woman, radiant and whole, and the child inside her was not an heir but a miracle. The brushwork was meticulous, reverent. It was not a photograph. It was a prayer. Eliza's tears fell before she could stop them. She turned to Julian, and he was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face: fear. Not the fear of losing control, but the fear of being seen. She took his hand, his paint-stained, beautiful hand, and placed it on her belly. "He kicked," she whispered. "He knows his father." Julian's breath caught. His palm pressed against the swell of her stomach, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. For a long moment they stood like that, connected by the life between them, the city glittering below like a promise. "He knows," Julian repeated, his voice breaking. They cooked dinner together. It was a disaster. Eliza burned the garlic, Julian oversalted the pasta, and they both forgot the timer on the bread, which emerged from the oven as a blackened brick. But they laughed until their stomachs ached, and when the meal was ready, they ate on the floor of the living room, the plates balanced on their laps, the city lights flickering below. Julian did not clean the kitchen. He left the dishes in the sink, the flour dusting the countertops, the remnants of their chaos scattered. Like evidence of a crime they had chosen to commit together. Eliza leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. His arm wrapped around her, his hand settling on her belly. "This is not in the contract," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." They watched the city in silence, the penthouse no longer a cage but a cocoon, the walls holding them in a warmth they had both been too afraid to name. The morning arrived with the sharpness of a blade. Eliza woke to the sound of voices in the foyer, Julian's voice, low and controlled, and another voice, slick as oil. She pulled on a robe and walked to the top of the stairs. Marcus Thorne stood in the doorway, a folder in his hand, his smile a knife's edge. "Julian," he said, "I have the board's resolution. You have until the end of the month to produce the signed waiver of parental rights, or we call a vote of no confidence." Julian took the folder. He did not open it. He looked at it as one might look at a tombstone, then he tore it in half. The sound was sharp, decisive, the paper falling like leaves in autumn. "Tell the board," Julian said, his voice carrying up the stairs, through the penthouse, into the heart of the city he had built, "that I am no longer their CEO." He paused. "I am a father." Marcus's smile faltered. "You're making a mistake." "I have made many mistakes," Julian said. "This is not one of them." He closed the door in Marcus's face. Eliza stood at the top of the stairs, her hand pressed to her belly, the child kicking inside her. Julian looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the harbor he had painted, the water dark and still, the boat waiting at the dock. But the boat was no longer empty. He was coming home. Chapter 11. The geometry of wreckage. The penthouse breathed at 3:17 a.m. Julian Ashford had memorized the rhythm of it, the sigh of the HVAC system, the distant hum of elevators climbing the spine of his tower, the creak of glass as the city's wind pressed against the walls. These were the sounds of order, of a world he had constructed with surgical precision. They had always been enough. Tonight, they were a lie. He moved through the marble halls in bare feet, a concession to sleeplessness he would never admit to. His robe hung loose, silk against skin that felt too thin, too porous. The penthouse stretched around him like a mausoleum of his own making, every surface polished, every angle intentional, every shadow banished by recessed lighting that never dimmed below a calculated luminescence. But something had shifted. The scent hit him first. Garlic and rosemary, clinging to the air like a ghost of warmth. It had been 3 hours since she'd cooked, since he'd watched from the doorway as Eliza Vance treated his kitchen like a studio, her hands moving with the same reckless grace she applied to canvas. She had left the stove unscrubbed. A smear of olive oil on the marble counter. A single sprig of rosemary discarded like a signature. He had cleaned it, of course he had, but the smell remained, embedded in the grout, in the fabric of the curtains, in the spaces between his ribs. Julian rounded the corner and stopped. She was on the sofa. The leather was white, Italian, custom-made to his specifications. No seams, no ornamentation, a monument to minimalism. Eliza lay across it like a storm's aftermath, one arm dangling, her fingers brushing the floor where a sketchbook had fallen. Her hair, that impossible tangle of chestnut and defiance, spilled across a cushion he had never allowed anyone to touch. She was breathing. Softly. The rise and fall of her chest was the only movement in a room designed to be static. He should wake her. Should remind her of the contract's clause regarding common areas after midnight. Should retreat to his office and bury himself in the wreckage of a merger he had abandoned for her. Instead, he knelt. The marble was cold against his knees, a sensation he catalogued and dismissed. His hand hovered over the sketchbook, fingers trembling with a hesitation he had not felt since he was 7 years old, watching his mother's car disappear down a gravel drive. He picked it up. The pages were rough, textured, stained with charcoal and something that might have been wine. He turned them slowly, each drawing a window into a mind he had tried to purchase but could never own. A bird with broken wings, a child's hand reaching for something unseen. A cityscape that looked like his tower but softer, as if seen through rain. Then he found himself. The man had hollow eyes. Julian recognized the architecture of his own face, the sharp jaw, the severe cheekbones, the mouth that had forgotten how to smile. But the eyes were wrong. They were empty, cavernous, as if someone had scooped out everything that made them human and left only the sockets. He had never seen himself so clearly. His breath caught. The sound was small, barely a whisper, but it was enough. Eliza stirred. He should have dropped the sketchbook. Should have retreated to his office, composed himself, rebuilt the walls that had begun to crumble at 3:17 a.m. But he could not move. He could only watch. As her eyelids fluttered, as awareness returned to her face like dawn breaking over a battlefield. Julian! Her voice was rough with sleep. It was the first time she had said his name without the sharp edges of defiance or the careful distance of formality. Just his name, like a question, like a door left ajar. You should be in bed. His own voice sounded foreign, scraped raw. I fell asleep. She sat up slowly, her hand going to her neck where a kink had formed. You're staring at my sketchbook. I'm staring at a drawing. Same thing. He closed the book but did not return it. You see me as hollow. I see you as you are. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. The movement was childlike, vulnerable, and it twisted something in his chest that he had thought atrophied years ago. Most people draw what they want to see. I draw what's there. And what's there? A man who's been empty so long he's forgotten what full feels like. The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples spread through him, disturbing sediment he had carefully layered over decades. He wanted to argue, to retreat behind the cold precision of his contract, to remind her that she was here for one purpose and one purpose only. But the merger, the board, Marcus Thorne's smile, waiting like a blade in the shadows. Everything I built today, he said, the words escaping before he could cage them, I tore down, for you. I didn't ask you to. No, you just made me want to. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the hum of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the sound of two people breathing in a room that had become too small for the things they were not saying. Eliza unfolded herself and stood. She moved toward him with the same unstudied grace she applied to everything, her bare feet silent on the marble. When she reached him, she did not touch him. She simply stood close enough that he could smell the rosemary still clinging to her skin. What did you lose today? The question was soft, but it cut deeper than any boardroom accusation. He turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows, where his reflection stared back at him, a ghost. In silk, a man made of glass and steel and carefully maintained illusions. Everything I built. The admission tasted like ash, and I don't know why I don't care. She did not offer comfort. He had expected her to, had braced for the soft touch, the gentle word, the pity that would have driven him back into his armor. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She challenged him. She walked to the far wall, the one he had left deliberately blank, a canvas of white that he told himself was aesthetic preference but was really fear of imperfection, and picked up a brush from a tray she had left on the floor. She held it out to him, handle first. Paint something, anything, break your own rules. He stared at the brush. It was cheap, synthetic, the kind an artist bought in bulk. The bristles were stained with ultramarine and burnt sienna, colors that spoke of skies and earth and things he had never allowed himself to touch. I don't paint. Everyone paints. She did not lower her hand. You just forgot how. He took the brush. His hand trembled. The sensation was foreign, unwelcome, a betrayal. Of every muscle he had trained to be steady. He had signed billion-dollar contracts with hands that did not shake. He had fired executives, ended partnerships, dismantled companies with fingers that moved like scalpels. But now, holding a brush worth less than the wine in his cellar, he could not stop the tremor. The blank wall stared at him. White, pure, waiting. He could not make a mark. The silence stretched, and with it, his shame. He felt Eliza's gaze on him, not judgmental but watchful, as if she were studying a specimen she had not yet classified. He wanted to drop the brush, to walk away, to retreat to his office and pretend this moment had never happened. But the penthouse door opened. The sound was precise, hydraulic, the hiss of a lock disengaging with military efficiency. Julian's head snapped up, his body moving before his mind caught up, positioning itself between Eliza and the door. Marcus Thorne stood in the foyer. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, charcoal gray, perfectly pressed. His smile was a razor's edge, thin and sharp and designed to draw blood. In his hand, a leather folder, thick with documents that smelled of legal threats and calculated betrayals. Mr. Ashford. Marcus's voice was honey over broken glass. We need to discuss the future of AethelCorp. His gaze shifted past Julian, landing on Eliza. The smile widened. And your guest. Julian's hand tightened on the brush. The handle bit into his palm, a grounding pain that kept him from doing something irrevocable. He could feel Eliza behind him, her presence a warmth at his back, a reminder of everything he had already risked. The future of AethelCorp, Julian said, his voice colder than the glass walls around them, does not involve you entering my home at 4 a.m. You're home. Marcus stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown. Or your surrogate's temporary residence? The board is concerned, Julian. Concerned that your judgment has been compromised. Concerned that the man who built this empire has forgotten what it takes to protect it. I haven't forgotten anything. No. Marcus stopped a few feet away, close enough that Julian could see the triumph flickering in his eyes. Then explain to me why you walked away from merger that would have doubled our market share. Explain why you've been seen at prenatal appointments. Explain why there's a painting on your wall. Julian followed his gaze. The painting Eliza had demanded, the one she had hung against his wishes, was a riot of color, a phoenix rising from flames, wings spread, beak open in a silent cry. It was the first thing he saw every morning and the last thing he saw every night. It was the most beautiful thing in his penthouse. That painting, Julian said slowly, is none of your concern. Everything that happens in this tower is my concern. Marcus's smile did not waver. I have a vote of confidence scheduled for tomorrow morning. Unless you can convince me, and the rest of the board, that you are still the man who built AethelCorp, I will be forced to recommend your removal. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Julian felt the weight of them, the gravity of everything he stood to lose, his empire, his legacy, the only identity he had ever known. But behind him, Eliza shifted. He heard the soft intake of her breath, the rustle of her clothes. As she moved closer, he felt her hand, light as a whisper, brush against his back. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of his carefully constructed life, holding a paintbrush he could not use, Julian Ashford realized that he had already lost everything that mattered. He just hadn't known it until now. "Tomorrow morning," Julian said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "I'll be there." Marcus's smile sharpened. "I look forward to it." He turned, his footsteps receding, the door hissing shut behind him. The penthouse fell silent again, but the silence was different now, charged, electric, waiting. Julian looked down at the brush in his hand. His hand was still trembling, but this time, when he looked at the blank wall, he did not see a void. He saw possibility. He saw the first crack in his armor, the first mark of chaos that would either destroy him or set him free. He raised the brush, and hesitated. Behind him, Eliza's voice came soft and sure. "You don't have to be perfect, Julian. You just have to start." The brush touched the wall, one mark, and the geometry of his wreckage began.